Thank you all for being here on this chilly night, and thank you so much to Artists First. We are always so delighted not only to have these kinds of collaborations, but to actually see how work that we have in the museum at any moment can influence or inspire other kinds of making. So it's really wonderful, and I do encourage everybody to take a closer look at some point. Before we get started in our conversation, I wanted to just say a few things about the exhibition itself and a little bit about how it came to be and a little bit about Shinichi's work in general. As Michelle said, this is the first U.S. solo museum presentation of Shinichi's work, and I think one of the most exciting things about organizing the show was being able to have these rather magical objects all together. There are 18 works in the show, and one of the things that really struck us, both myself and Jen Sedul-Edwards, the co-organizer of this from the Mint Museum, we had seen a work by this artist, and we're very, very intrigued. But what happens when they come together is they are much larger and much more present than their scale would have you believe. And I think that was one of the things that really drew us to this work, was that they have extraordinary presence for little objects, for intimate-sized objects. I also think the thing that we hear a lot, and this is one of the things that we're gonna speak about, is a lot of people who have been compelled by this work talk about it as something that is both strange and familiar. And they say that in terms of what it looks like, that there are characters that can come from real life. There are things that really are, a toad, or Shinichi's version therein, or a lizard, and then there are these kind of created and magical, sometimes hybrid, sometimes humanoid figures that come from a place of imagination and myth. And I think it really is that in between, that liminal space in which they live, that has been so incredibly compelling. So just a few notes about Sawada himself. For more than 2 decades, he's based in the Shiga prefecture in Japan, has been producing ceramics with support from the Nakayoshi Fukushikai Welfare Association. So this is an association that offers social and developmental support to a range of neurodivergent and disabled individuals. And Sawada himself has non-speaking autism and has worked for many, many years with some of the same people at the foundation, one of who's kind of, I think we talk about him. This is Matsuharu Ikitani, who is the kiln master, who actually fires his work. So he works on these pieces throughout the year, but only during a certain season of every year are these wood-fired kilns stoked and fed, and therefore these works can be fired. And it's a really, really interesting thing, having spoken specifically with Jennifer Gilbert, who has been Shinichi's gallerist for many, many years, about the rapport between the kiln master and the artist, and the way in which these sculptures really come to life through the firing process, and the sort of delight at what happens to them. They're all the same clay, there is no glazing, but it really is, I understand that it's chemical, but I think of it as the magic of the wood firing process that truly creates this extraordinary range of surfaces, from the glossy to the matte. These colors, when you look at the exhibition, they really have this incredible range both in surface and in color, and it is magic. The other thing I just want to mention, when I talked about this kind of both strange and familiar, Shinichi's work really came onto a more global stage by being shown in the Encyclopedic Palace, which was the 2013 Venice Biennale organized by Massimiliano Gioni. And I think what's really interesting about that, as we go into our discussion, is that the context for seeing this work within this larger, important contemporary art exhibition, I think really gave it a platform, not only for visibility, but also gave it a certain kind of context outside of what had often been the case for his work prior, which was in an outsider fair context or in a self-taught context. And so I think that's also something we really want to think about when we're talking about this work. Okay. So let's get to our conversation. I will just share that one of the reasons that we had spoken with Angelik and asked her to write this catalog essay is, you heard in her bio not only her familiarity and understanding of works of clay, but the context in which those things happen. And we had learned, and this was actually through Jen, that you had been really engaged in this idea of the figurative, the funky, and the cute. And what is cuteness in contemporary art? We often think of that as something that is so pejorative, but in fact, it holds a pretty extraordinary amount of power, and it is something that can bring people into a work of art. So you seemed like exactly the right voice for us. Just a couple of thank yous, which I think are really, really important. I want to say that the exhibition has been generously supported in part by the National Endowment for the Arts, Alexis Kosei and Eric Karanik, and the Faring Family Foundation. And the exhibition publication, I couldn't help but show you this because it has a front and a back, and it really gives you a sense of how these creatures, these sculptures have such presence and such personality. We think this is an owl, by the way, but that just gives you a little bit of a sense of how even the everyday animal, bug, whatever in Shinichi's hands turns into something bigger, more extraordinary. But the exhibition publication has been generously supported in part by Jennifer Lauren Gallery and James Cohen Gallery. And I want to say thank you so much to CAM staff, who is extraordinary in bringing these exhibitions together. But I have to say a particular thank you to Grace Early, who is our exhibitions assistant, without whom this publication would not have happened. So it's very important. Yeah, round of applause. And tonight's discussion is generously supported in part by the Japan Foundation, New York, and the Robert Lehman Foundation. Okay, so my first question for you, and we can kind of jump around, and I'm gonna put us back and forth on this screen just with images from the show, is that you talk a lot in your wonderful essay. You sort of start it with this idea. It's called an open-ended question. And you talk about this idea that there are extraordinary dualities in this work, and I think that's a great place to start from.
Okay, thank you for the invitation to be here, for the invitation to write about Sawada's work. I just want to preface by saying I'm not an expert in his work. I had encountered his work years ago at the booth of the Outsider Art Fair at Frieze in New York, and I was really taken by the work, and really, every time I saw it, I was into it, right? So I absolutely jumped at the moment to write about the work, and I will confess, it was really hard to write about the work at first, because I think in the art world, we're very used to didactics. We're very used to sort of writing so much about something and knowing everything about something. And we usually have the artist there or some kind of archive to tell us everything, and we just kind of reformulate it somehow and come up with new ideas about the work. But we have some kind of basis. And with Sawada's work, there's so much mystery around it because the artist himself only has shared some words about what his work is about. So the first thing that just as on a gut level about the work is that duality of in the essay I described there's a attraction and repulsion to the work. I want to touch it, but I also, it's wait, there's thorns and teeth and spikes, and it's might hurt me to touch this object. And then some of them, the earlier work, which I think falls more under the cute realm, as opposed to the more recent work, I liked how I felt they could be going ooh, ooh, but they could also be like, ah. There's just like all these expressions that they have, but like it just kind of depends on like how, like your own interpretation of them, but it could be like positive or negative. Like there's just all these like different places you could go with it. And then again, what you said, the strangeness and the familiarity at the same time, because they both feel super contemporary, and at the same time, you could have just dug it up from the ground and you could have been like, yeah, this is ancient stuff, and like I would believe you. So there's just, it's like this almost anachronistic work in that it can live anywhere.
I think that's exactly right. And I do think that the thing that is so interesting is this timelessness of it, which is exactly what you sort of describe. And just a kind of funny thing, we were trying to figure out what the title of this exhibition should be. And, you know, you're kind of noodling and thinking on it. And at one point we were like, it should be, you know, bumps, eyes, and teeth. You know, like there are these things that are so prevalent, so consistent, and there is a thorniness to all of these works, whether it's the lizard or whether it's the dragon. And that's really interesting because it's exactly what you're talking about. Like, is this a dear, interesting presence, or is it something that's gonna get you, you know? So I think that's really, really interesting.
Yeah, and I think it's maybe further than duality, but just like the way that he deals with like the material and like the combination between like what he's creating / the magic that happens in the kiln, and how I feel like it looks like many materials at the same time. Yeah. Like the darker pieces almost look like metal, or like the browner ones look like wood, and like I describe it in the essay, some of them look like bread. So yeah. Like there's all these different like qualities to the sculptures, and it just kind of depends on which one you encounter and like your response to it. This is probably the project that I felt the most, like that it made me have to kind of go based on feelings and not entirely of just thoughts. Yeah. Because again, there was just so much sort of mystery, and that's why I called my essay like a new entry into the lore of his work, because I feel like everything that has been written about him is lore. It's just something, it's sort of this mythology that we are creating with him and for him, maybe?
Yeah. Well, it is pretty rare when you are working with contemporary artists that you do not have access to the artist, that you don't have access to the artist's thoughts, that they can't articulate or they haven't articulated for you what their interests are, or what it is that is driving them to create these things. I wanted to I'm gonna bring us to this slide because one of the other things that you discuss in the essay is sort of his connection to various aesthetic and different kinds of art making traditions in Japanese culture. And you talk both about wabi-sabi and kawaii, and I was wondering if you could take us through like, what are those things and how do they relate to this body of work?
Yeah, so wabi-sabi is sort of this acceptance of the beauty of something that's very unique and like sort of how it is and like the sort of natural state of it. And then kawaii, I read this book. It's called the Our Aesthetic Categories. I highly recommend it. It's been really influential in my practice. And one of the categories in that book is cuteness. It's cute, the cute. I wrote an article in 2020 in which I just started noticing a lot of contemporary ceramic artists who were engaging with this idea of the cute in their work, and they were using it to talk about some pretty serious things, but it was just like this sort of dismantling or like this subversive entry into these socio-political things. But so what is earlier work, I would say more specifically, it's pretty cute. It's pretty darn cute. Or I would almost call it ugly cute, like this idea of like do I like it? But you just kind of want to take care of it at the same time. There's just like these cute little faces, and kawaii specifically, it's actually supposed to be an aesthetic of powerlessness. So it's like, it looks like something that needs to be taken care of, and that's how it disarms you. That's how it gets you. So there's a lot of like mistrust of the kawaii as well. And so I feel like his work does both with the wabi-sabi and the kawaii, because there's like such like uniqueness to every work that he's created. Like there, you can see like the sort of the flanking images here, like they share similarities, but they're also so different at the same time, and you just kind of have to accept it. And the example that I think of is often of like a raku fired tea bowl, and that's part of the ceremony, appreciating the uniqueness of that tea bowl for that in that moment. And so I think it's the same thing with his work. Like, I love looking at like, well, this one kind of leaned a little bit more right, or just like, even though like there's precision to the way that he's putting these like thorns or spikes, there's still a very like handmade quality to the work. Like, a human made this. And I think that's really wonderful. But going back to the kawaii, like, they have these like little faces, and some of them have like belly buttons, which is also very cute. So there's something like very sort of like creature-like about the work. Like, there's clearly characters, and I think Japan is kingdom for characters, whether it's like anime or manga or anything like that, or plushies,
Right.
whatever. It's like they're so good at it. Yeah. In these images, I don't know if you want to ask something
please,
specific.
go
Okay.
ahead.
So, again, not an expert at this, but like I was saying, like, his work can look ancient as well. And we don't know what he's seen and what he's like kind of like ingrained into his system from like maybe just existing in Japan, right? Like, maybe he's gone to a museum and encountered work like this at a museum. We don't know. I don't know, at least, right? But I do think that there's qualities to it in which, like, I could see these kinds of work in a show, sharing space with Sawada, and it would make total sense to me. On the left, it's these funerary sculptures, and there's the cuteness to it, especially like the little arms up and the like little face that's going like, that's Sawada's earlier work looks exactly like that. It's like very simplified face, but there's so much emotion that carries in just a very simple face. And then these like more elaborate, like sort of more decorative ceremonial vessels, like Sawada takes a lot of time on the surfaces of his work. Like, that's really the core of it. It's just all this work that he's doing to the surface. And again, like, I don't know if he's seen these bowls, but maybe he has, and maybe he hasn't, and it's just something like collective memory or something that somehow comes out this way.
It's so interesting because one of the things is we don't actually know what his time at the foundation is like. We know what he does. We know that he works both in the clay studio and also in the bakery. So, you know, we understand what his kind of schedule is, et cetera. But we really don't understand very much about what do the people who are in these various art making classes, whether it's textiles or clay or the other things that they're doing, we don't know too much about what instruction is like. One of the other things that's a really interesting question is that the actual process by which, you know, these wood-fired kilns, which are fired over like a 3-day period it takes to continually feed these kilns, et cetera, that is something that's, you know, hundreds, if not thousands of years old in Shiga Prefecture. So that's also really interesting, right? This idea of being part of a process and an aesthetic tradition. And one of the things that people have sort of talked about in this work is actually there are many, many, many dragons in his work. You know, so there are these serial images. When we went back here, you can see, oops, sorry, wrong way. that this is a form that he was looking at again and again around 2010. There are certain things that he repeats and repeats. And one of the most prevalent things is the dragon. And so a lot of people have sort of thought about that being part of a traditional Japanese aesthetic, but we don't really know from where that has come, right? Like how he was exposed or what he saw or what he knows.
But that makes sense to me. I feel like none of us live in a vacuum. Like we're all like, whether we are conscious or not, we're like consuming everything around us. And the dragon is a huge symbol in Japan. And I think especially in these images, you see the little sort of chicken legs. That's a very specific like dragon quality in Japan. One of my favorite movies is Spirited Away by Hayao Miyazaki. And the dragons have chicken legs. So like, I just think it's very particular. But I think like also thinking about Kotani, who is his studio mate, and seeing a clear shift in the way that Sawada was making work when he got the studio mate, it's just sort of like a osmosis of like everything that's around you, you kind of absorb and it manifests somehow in the work that you make. I just feel like it works that way, even though we don't know like what media he might be consuming, right? At home maybe, or not.
What Angelik is discussing, and so we have an image here, is that at one point around 2017, he got a new studio mate, and it was a moment for a shift in his work. You see many fewer of those kind of totem type objects, and you see more monstrous objects. They become a little bit more
aggressive.
They become a little bit more aggressive. There's a lot more, instead of that, that little open mouth, there begins to be much more of this kind of, teeth bared, and they're coming to get you. And so it's really, really interesting because the studio mate indeed was making work that had a different quality to it. So this is what.
Yeah, and I think it was definitely an influence to, so the part of the way that Sawada works is that he takes his old work or like work that he has finished and like places it on the table with him, and he kind of keeps working on a row. So the way that I see it is, it wouldn't be weird that with his studio mate working next to him, he is similarly looking at his own work and looking at the studio mate's work, and then kind of creating a hybrid of sorts, and then also just evolving his practice based on like his lived experience.
One note, which is also really interesting, is that because the kilns are outside, so you can see it, it's almost like a hut with corrugated metal. This is a seasonal endeavor. And yet Shinichi is making these objects all year long. And so it has been described to me that there are an extraordinary number of works that have not been fired. There are years worth of these objects that are in this kind of studio where they're working that don't actually come to the kiln. And so that's really interesting too, this idea of what is it that comes to light? What is it that we actually see because it is fired? There isn't enough time to get through, or space to be able to actually fire all these works. And that's really interesting to me too. I wonder a little bit about, what it is that we do see, what it is that does come into exhibitions like this. Are those choices that Shinichi is making? If you only listen, you got these 17, but listen, today you're only going to get one that goes in the kiln. Which one is it? What are the choices that you make? And it is really also interesting to think, yes, of this army of these objects over, a 20-year period that are still there sort of waiting for their more permanent life to come.
Because I think there's power in numbers for his work. I think it's amazing to be able to see all these works together because they're so rare to find them because they're not all getting fired, right? And
Yep.
only getting fired sometimes 2 times a year or something like that. But I really think there's something about them having a gaggle of them. I really enjoy that.
They speak to one another.
Yeah.
They have relationships with one another. And I think that that is going back to this idea of the presence and the fact that they are animated in a way. And that really does come to the fore when they have a chance to be with one another.
Yeah, I especially like the earlier work. They're like mischievous wood sprites, which I will note that there's this video or like documentary that was made at some point, and there's this scene of these like earlier ones. They did like a little stop motion kind of thing in which they're like la, 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 like running into the studio, and I thought that was like the best thing they could have done because that's exactly what they feel like.
Yeah.
So it was great to like see them animated that way.
All right, I'm gonna switch gears a little bit and sort of ask you, I mean, these are really singular works. They are very signature works. It is very clear now that we've seen these, you're gonna know a Shinichi Sawada when you see one. But just from your perspective and having looked at other kinds of, I'm gonna call it figurative sculpture, even though, you know, we can argue exactly what that means. What do you think are the kind of contemporaries, the other artists who are working that are able to create this same effect with the work that they do, or that we think can create the same effect?
Sure. I will note that I think there's a lot of contemporary artists that are working in sort of this essence of work that yes, figurative, but work that feels very handmade, very human in a way, like very heartfelt, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. And it's work that like I'm very drawn to. So like I just feel like I'm like looking for it all over the place. I mentioned some examples, like very specific examples in the on the essay, but I feel like I can like go on and so yeah, please.
Sorry, I keep flipping, but this is a back and forth visual exercise.
So on the, well, actually, I don't know. I don't know. Is that the right or left? Whatever. The frog. It's not a contemporary. Gilhooly has passed. But he's a funk ceramicist, which if you heard my bio, I did this show called Funk You Too, in which I was putting together the sort of original funk ceramicists with contemporary artists working sort of in the same vein. And I really like Gilhooly's Bread Frogs, thinking of Sawada working at the bakery, clearly working with his hands at the bakery and then at the clay studio, and how like I would love to see the bread that he's making, honestly. Because I wonder if like they're just like, no, you're just making a loaf, or if like he's getting creative because
Thorny loaves.
Because you can create some pretty amazing things with bread, actually. And like I mentioned before, his work kind of looks like bread, like it toasts like bread. And so Gilhooly was very clever. He was making all this like food ceramics, which are also coming back in popularity. Like so many artists are doing food art right now. But he took advantage of the fact that clay kind of behaves like, dough, to make these bread frogs, which apparently were like popular in the 70s or something. Like people were legit making frog loaves of bread. And he actually put poppy seeds on these, like actual poppy seeds. But a contemporary, although she is like in her 80s, maybe in her 90s now, Magdalena Suarez Frimkes. I don't know if the show is still up, but she had her first like major museum show at LACMA recently. And it's such an incredible show of like mostly little things. Like she makes these like little sculptures, mostly of like pretty recognizable cartoons like Minnie Mouse or Mickey Mouse, Popeye and what is it? Olive oil.
Olive oil.
Sorry, I saw it in Spanish, and so she had a different name. But her work, even though unlike Sawada, like she has training, like she, did residencies and went to school for art or whatever. But there's something very sort of naive about the work, but in that like she's just free about how the way that she makes the work, and she's like committed to this cast of characters. Like Sawada, like you can recognize like there's this kind of like there's the totem-like kind of more tree-like sculptures, or like there's the clear dragons, or the clear like more animalistic or bestiary, and so I think there's something to like creating this like identity for yourself in your practice. But again, I think there's just in general, whether you fall officially under the outsider category or not, there is a move towards more free figurative making in clay. Then so this is Joel Gaitan's works, and Joel, he's not trained in ceramics. He just like picked it up one day, and like he's trained as an artist, but not as a ceramic artist. And I think his work is a great sort of contemporary take on looking back at ancient ceramics. Specifically, he's looking at indigenous ceramics from like South America, and then creating this very contemporary work that's talking about like his identity. And in that way, I think like all these works can like different like sort of path, but they can all live together.
Mm-hmm. One thing that I think is worth kind of considering, and we talked about this at the very beginning, and then you just mentioned it, is that Shinichi's work had been seen very much in a self-taught context. And I would say really the difference in that was this Venice Biennale that work was in. And actually, when we were organizing this exhibition, it was, I think, quite important to both James Cohan Gallery and also the Jennifer Lauren Gallery to have the work be seen in a contemporary context as contemporary art, and not in a medium specific context, so not in a craft museum, in a clay museum, but also this idea of in a contemporary space alongside and in the context of other contemporary artists. And I think that there is, like anything else, when you categorize, and particularly words, whether it's self-taught, whether it's outsider, that has changed over time, and we have used different words over time. But any kind of categorization narrows the scope of how things are looked at, or how things, regardless of how you present them, how they might be seen or what the context that they're in. So just interestingly, this was very important to the gallerists, and perhaps the artist, again, we don't know exactly what Shinichi's wishes are to have this work seen and where it is seen. But if you could just talk a little bit about that, the difference between the aesthetic of the work and who is making it, and what that context is, and certainly what you have seen within the kind of world of clay.
Yeah, I often stumble when we're talking about the category of outsider art. Usually means like somebody who doesn't have, I guess, official like academic training for art, or often there's like a blurry line between folk art and outsider art. And often it has meant people who haven't had the same opportunities as others to be in sort of mainstream art, often people with disabilities or people of color, like they've fallen into these categories. And self-thought and all these things. So yeah, often I think it's like a problematic categorization, but I also understood like context, right? I think we're definitely in a different space, just like with the word craft. I think we've made huge headway with like the stigma around that word. I think it's the same thing that's going on with like outsider art. It's been growing and growing, the presence of outsider artists in a mainstream context. I was talking earlier, there's a gallery in LA called Tierra del Sol that specifically works with artists with disabilities. And honestly, I'm a huge fan of their program. I think all the work is amazing. Like, I was never disappointed every time I went to see a show. And a lot of the work in my personal collection is artists from their program or from other galleries who also work with artists with disability. I think I just love the freedom, honestly, that I think comes from not having to prescribe to the art systems. And it's great that we're able to appreciate them in this context, in this very standard, mainstream art context, that we're able to give it the same sort of consideration and the same value as someone who, did their MFA or whatever. So I think it's great. It's great to be in this moment that we get to have a show like this one here.
Should we open it up to questions? We have some time to be able to take questions. Uh-oh, I see one in the very front row.
You're talking about a seasonal time. What time of season is it? It looked like it was spring or fall. And how long is that season for? And do they have to do it seasonal because of humidity or temperature and so on?
So this is my understanding, and it may not be exact. It is something that takes place in the spring. It is about being in warmer weather for the comfort of the people who are working at the kiln. It is a place where there is winter, and if you saw, there's snow, and just to sort of show you, you're very much kind of out in nature, and so it's a very practical concern. The other thing that is really incredible that we learned from Jennifer Gilbert is that the feeding of this kiln is a ritualized and ceremonial and really extraordinary part of the tradition. And it can take, I can't remember what they said in terms of the amount of wood that it takes to get it to this extraordinarily high temperature. And so you are feeding this kiln constantly for like 3 days to get it going. So also practically, it's not the kind of thing you can just, we're going to do this once a month, not
financially also.
Financially, in terms of time. And so it's become this very special time in the way that it works, and the artists who have work that they want to get fired, you're sort of waiting for this period. And the whole thing really takes on this kind of amazing ceremonial part.
Honestly, it kind of works with like the market system, because it's making the demand is higher than what's available. So it's actually working really well with the market.
And my understanding is that this kind of kiln outside, the way that it is also quite literally been the same for 1,000 years, right? That this, I don't know, do you know how big the kiln, just like how big it is? I know there's single chambers, but there's more than one. And I don't know how big this one is.
I remember seeing photos of the kiln itself.
I don't either.
It must be like...
No answer for you.
Yeah, I don't know. Because I don't know if it's only them two firing, or if there are more studio mates maybe.
There have to be other people who are in the studio who are also having their works fired. I don't know how many. I don't know what the volume is, but...
Try to find this documentary. I think it might be in there that you can like see Mr. Ikutani putting works into the kiln.
Yeah, half a dozen wood kilns in the area here. They're all different sizes.
Yeah. Yeah, kilns come in all sizes.
Right.
Ceramic artists are always looking for the bigger ones.
I just have a quick question. You mentioned about how his work has been seen in galleries and whatever. Do you think, and I hate to use this term postmodernism because it makes me gag, but do you think with the advent of postmodernism that this idiosyncratic work is acceptable now to the mainstream art market or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, thinking of specifically craft, I think we also went through the sloppy craft period.
We're talking about,
right?
Sloppy craft.
There was like a point in which like craft was expected to be very virtuosic, really perfect, I think. And then came people like Volkos who were like, nope, just slashing everything and it's just gonna be abstract. So I feel like we go through waves. We go through waves of like, I want work that's really tight or I want work that's really loose. And I think right now we are in a loose moment in a way, like, I think most of the work that's being made by specifically younger artists, it's pretty loose. Things that you can recognize, whether it's a creature or a figure of some kind, but there's the surface work can be very abstract. There's a lot of experimentation with the way that they're doing glazes, or maybe they're like using underglaze pencils to like kind of scribble and do these drawings on them. There's just like a looseness and a freedom that is, I think, more like prevalent right now. Yeah. Any more questions?
All the contemporary wood fire people around town, but if you make contact with them, you'd be there for film.
Yeah.
Sorry, let me just get this for you so you can get.
And what comes out of the kiln is on tables right outside the kiln. You can buy whatever you want generally.
That's cool. But I don't. I think it's hard to find wood burning kilns.
Well, there is a, I don't know if you've seen it, but there is a piece that we created that's basically a touch piece. It's a series of tiles. And one of the things that we did was say, who has a wood fire kiln? Because we wanted something that was not only going to have a little thorniness and some of the bumps or whatever, but that was actually going to have a surface that was akin to those of Shinichi's work. So, but that's Dan's kiln. And just one aside, when we were talking about this ceremony of, days and days, and he was like, I built it so that the thing can be up to temperature in 3 hours.
Wow, that's amazing. I always say that ceramic artists are really sort of brave. Well, they are. To be an artist, generally, you have to be brave. But ceramic artists, there's a certain push and pull between like how much you can plan and how much is just like,
Right.
hope for the best, because who knows what's gonna happen in the kiln?
Yeah.
It could blow up, or something weird happens with the glaze, or something magical happens with the glaze, or like Sawada's work. Nobody knows what's gonna come out of the kiln. We don't know what the color is gonna be, or I'm sure Mr. Iketani can kinda. With his experience, he can probably expect what it's gonna look like. But there's such subtleties to the surfaces of these works. So I think that's what's special about the wood burning kiln. It's like so much to chance.
Yeah.
Which like more sort of electrical kilns, you will likely be able to know what's gonna come out, as opposed to the wood burning kiln.
I have sort of almost an administrative question. We've been talking about the artist in this sort of unique situation where he's not lacking the means to sort of express exactly every thought that goes into this creation, which I realized is very familiar. Like art history is filled with dead individuals and entire societies, and it feels like triangulating a lack of information is very common curatorially, but also in this situation, you can here's high-res photos of the studio. Let's zoom with a studio mate. Can I ask a little more about your experience with this kind of irregular flow of information?
I think the most important thing in being able to gather more information, to be able to understand the history, to be able to understand a little bit more about Shinichi really comes through Jennifer Gilbert, who is the Jennifer Lauren Gallery based in the UK. And what has been the case here is that she has been working with this material for 15 years and has made many trips to the studio, spent time there, and really has been the person through whom we have learned the most. Just about everything else has really been what we've seen, or the mythology that you're talking about.
Yeah, I feel like I preface my essay with like, this is an interpretation. It's not law. It's not, you know, like it's just observations. And of course, like, I feel like, you know, there's footnotes and things like, there's things to back up these interpretations. But at the end of the day, they are interpretations of what I'm observing and my own experience of looking and like seeing the work in person. But there is a lot of trust with Jennifer and like what she's been able to garner from her time spent there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there is at least one more direct or at least adjacent conduit. And I think that has been really, really, really important. And that's also how we've been able to communicate back. You know, you're having the show, it's going to the Mint Museum, and then it's coming to CAM, and we're in St. Louis, and you know what I mean? Like all of that sort of also that communication loop back has really, really flowed through her. All right. Well, with that, I will say thank you so much for being here. I will make a pitch for our catalog, but also for your wonderful book, which is at the front if anybody is interested. And once again, before you leave, please do take time to look at these fabulous works of art that we have on view. Thank you so much.